So we're going to go now to Lexi Ellingsworth. She is, along with her co-founder, Liz, Lexi launched Stop Surrogacy Now UK, a grassroots organisation to challenge surrogacy law reform, which is currently being proposed in the UK. They hope to raise awareness of the other side of surrogacy and share the stories of women with surrogacy regret. So thank you so much, Lexi, and over to you.
I'm Lexi Ellingsworth. I'm the co-founder of Stop Surrogacy Now UK. Those are our contact details, just for you to note down if you'd want to be in touch with us. Just to explain a little bit, first of all, to explain about how we sort of came into being. As I said earlier, myself and my co-founder Liz met on a parenting forum where we were discussing surrogacy law reform and the Law Commission's public consultation. And based on the concerns that we had, I did a freedom of information request to establish who was involved in the design of the consultation. And that was quite a long period of time, from from August 2019 until July 2020. And we were concerned about the likely bias coming from the pro-surrogacy lobbyists, such as the surrogacy agencies, the lawyers and the fertility clinics. And we decided to launch a single issue grassroots campaign to challenge the proposals that were made clear in the consultation documents. We formed Stop Surrogacy Now UK in August 2020. We also launched a discussion group on Facebook, which now has 200 members. And rather reluctantly, I joined Twitter with the campaign in August 2021. And you can find us at Wombs Not For Rent. So the law as we are now, the surrogate mother is the legal mother at birth. A parental order transfers parental rights, and advertising surrogacy services is currently banned. Essentially, by changing the current model from the one we have now to one with a pre-birth agreement, which grants parental rights to the commissioning parents at birth, we're shifting to a commercial model. There is a clear issue of ownership and how this can, and we feel will, influence the pregnancy, the body autonomy and the decision-making power of the surrogate mother. Because if you own the baby inside the woman's body, how much of her body and her choices do you own too? We feel that I need to ask, does this shift the arrangement from trust and friendship, which is a narrative that is consistently promoted by surrogacy agencies, to one of property and ownership? And then also, by lifting the ban on advertising, will women be encouraged to sign up as surrogate mothers? We consider this a potential issue when it's put into the context of the cost of living crisis following years of austerity, and now we're living in a post-COVID Britain. There are wealthy women who become surrogate mothers, but if we lift the ban on advertising, and would it appeal to capture single mothers, students, and any other women who are looking to feed their children? So that's one of our concerns. So moving on to our list of concerns is really going over that again, the removal of the legal rights of the surrogate mother at birth. There is no set age of women to be surrogate mothers, but basically in the Brazier report, which I'll get onto a bit later on, it was from 21, and that would be looking to have it to begin at 18 years old. And then there's a general lack of limits, of upper age limits, numbers of pregnancies, etc. I'm just going to spend some time on this because it's quite important, really. We believe that the transfer of parental rights at birth will take us to a more commercial style surrogacy model here in the UK. Currently, the transfer of parental rights takes place via a parental order process, which can be applied for within 6 months after the birth. And it's approved by a judge, but it's a fait accompli, really, as the baby is already in the custody of the commissioning parents from birth, and they are the primary carers. Even the level of expenses rarely raises an eyebrow. So the system largely secures the transfer of parental rights, of legal parental rights, to suit all parties involved, and the 6 months allows for a cooling off period. It's claimed that the current system causes issues around medical decisions, and there's a problem with the automatic parental rights of the surrogate mother's spouse. But medical decisions can be made by the commissioning parents with the approval of the surrogate mother. And there is actually a form that can be completed by the surrogate mother's husband if he wants to relinquish parental rights during the pregnancy. So we don't really see a justification for this change, as there's only a handful of cases have been proven to be challenged in court. there's one recent case, actually. I'm going to ask Liz, if she's on the line, to drop that into the chat. But there was a relationship breakdown between the surrogate mother, her husband on one side, and then the commissioning parents on the other. And it undermines this narrative of the friendship first that's being pushed by surrogacy agencies. There's no one can legally force a friendship between different adults, and this recent case does underline this. It was a recent case ruled by the European Court of Human Rights in May, so just earlier this year, and it kept the mother's name and the name of her husband on the birth certificate of the little girl who she gave birth to and who was commissioned by two men. The child arrangement order means the daughter is legally required to have contact with her mother. As we were saying, the minimum age recommended by the Brazier report, which looked at surrogacy law in the UK in 1998, it was for women to be surrogate mothers from 21 years old. And some surrogate agencies set this as their minimum requirement. But the Law Commission suggests that 18 years is the age limit, be the minimum. So to align with legal adulthood, that would be the same for the minimum age for intended parents as well. But this opens up a whole new group of women available for surrogacy, which is a plus for surrogacy agencies, but not so for the women of that age, due to an increase in likelihood for maternal death. And you can look at the statistics on that from Embrace. These women are only just adults in the eyes of the law. They can be extremely vulnerable and may later regret their involvement in surrogacy. It has not been proposed that a woman engaging in surrogacy must have experienced pregnancy and birth, so she cannot give informed consent. And it's conceivable that she could be giving up her first and possibly only child, possibly to a couple who are in their later years, because there was a CAFCAS study of parental orders in 2013 to 2014, so just for 1 year, and it recorded the oldest intended parent at 66 years old. Examples given to the Law Commission included a commissioning mother in her 60s and a commissioning father in his 70s. And so given the obvious likelihood of a surrogate-born child to an older couple being orphaned before reaching adulthood, it was surprising to us that the Law Commission did not propose any did not introduce any statutory age limits on commissioning parents. And finally, there's no limit proposed for the number of surrogacy pregnancies you can have. Serial surrogacy, as I call it, is quite rare, but the obstetric risks are obvious. Despite this, a conversation that we had with the Human Fertility Embryology Authority, which is HFEA, we spoke to them once, and it can be summed up as saying that they said, we do not limit how many children you can have for yourself, so we should not limit how many you want to have for others. That was essentially the gist of the conversation. Surrogate mothers have spoken on the addictive nature of surrogacy and how it gives them an almost drug-induced high. So with this in mind, it seems sensible to limit how many times you can do it, but there was no suggestion of this and no regard for safeguarding in the consultation. My Freedom of Information requests revealed that surrogacy lawyers and surrogacy agencies from both in the UK and abroad were involved in the design of the consultation. The replies also confirmed that Stonewall was involved, and there was a deliberate focus on gay press in their media plans. So just looking at this extract here, this is highlighted text from the Law Commission. These aren't my highlights. There was also general coverage in the national media, such as BBC and national newspapers, but no women's media was sought out. And I thought that unusual because actually women's magazines have historically been sympathetic and encouraging of surrogacy. So we thought that was an interesting point to make on the Freedom of Information request. This is a list of women's organisations who were approached. They were invited to participate before the launch of the consultation, the public consultation, but it was only after the public consultation closed that feminist organisations were approached. The Freedom of Information request also showed that there were meetings with the Department of Education, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and with surrogate mothers, but just one voice of an adult born of surrogacy was consulted. I would like to make a point about expenses, because I do think this is actually quite key to whether this is, we have altruistic surrogacy or whether it's considered commercial in the UK. a 2015 study from the University of Kent in 2015 stressed that surrogacy in the UK should not be transactional. It uses terms like compensation and being recompensed. In this survey, there was just over a quarter of respondents were surrogate mothers, and among their concerns was a clear desire for surrogacy to remain non-commercial. And one male partner of a surrogate mother indicated that his belief was that money taints the surrogacy relationship. So if we look in more detail at the expenses here, you can see this is actually an extract from the Law Commission's public consultation, and you can see the list of what they include as pregnancy-related items. As I said, the 1998 Brazier report said that surrogate mothers should not be paid in excess of reasonable level of actual expenses incurred as a result of the pregnancy, but they should be paid for out-of-pocket expenses. And this can include anything from petrol and parking for say, hospital scans and appointments to a loss of earnings. But it also included to a flat rate of compensation for loss of fallopian tubes or hysterectomy. And looking at this list of what could be included as a claimed expense, I'm wondering whether is food a pregnancy expense or is it a basic cost of life? And is rent an expense relating to a surrogacy pregnancy, or is that just something that we, have to pay for if we have a rent or mortgage to pay? And then lastly, is a post-birth holiday for the surrogate mother and her family an out-of-pocket expense? I think it's a bit of a grey area. So in terms of what you can do to support us, if you'd like to support us and get involved, you can find us on Twitter or email us from our contacts page on our website. There are also actions on the website, and one of the most recent ones is relating to the special committee in Ireland, and they're looking at legalising international surrogacy. International surrogacy is almost entirely commercial, so this is quite a concern for us, and we've been looking at that in some detail and moving our focus away from UK reform for that purpose, because that report actually was released the day before yesterday. It was on the 7th. I'm happy to take some questions if we have time, but before doing so, I'd like to pose some. I'd like to ask, what does surrogacy tell us about how we value women? What does it say about our society, which legitimizes the sale of children? And if the market has already been created, can we ask ourselves, where does this lead? Quite astounding sometimes how it's not limited by age. I would say that there's a range of so it's young women, but then there's obviously sort of women more in their 40s, and they think that ultimately if a woman wants to have a baby and give a baby away, that's her right to do so. And I think it just immediately ignores whether the child has any rights. It's just ultimately that the child, which is absolutely at the center of all surrogacy arrangements, right? Like, it's obviously that's the reason why this is happening, is to produce a child at the end. But that child is not almost considered human. They're not kind of considered a whole person with rights of their own. So it is rather interesting that in the younger generations that there would be, first of all, I find it interesting that there's a comparison between abortion and surrogacy, because I find them to be totally opposite things. I mean, they are literally quite the opposite. One of them is terminating a pregnancy, so a child is not born, so that fetus doesn't grow and become a baby and be born. And the other one is almost, in my mind, it's like a planned adoption, because you're literally deliberately getting pregnant in order to give that child to somebody who is not the mother, so to remove the child from the mother. And it's the opposite of an abortion, of a termination of a pregnancy. So it's very interesting when those two things are compared. And then it's also quite interesting when the younger generations see them as both under human rights. And then if you see them under human rights, then you neglect to see that the child has human rights. And we do have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which does have an article in there about identity, which isn't in the terms that we put it in now with self-ID and gender ideology. It's actually under the identity of nationality and having your knowing your family and knowing your genetic roots. And something that's very interesting in this area is genealogical bewilderment, which we know is evident in children who've been adopted, who obviously in adults who know about the fact that where their circumstances of their birth, not knowing their genetic connections as they grow up. And also it's evident in children who are donor conceived. And there's no such studies on this on surrogate born children, but of course, if you're donor conceived and surrogate born, you could be likely to develop or experience genealogical bewilderment. So there's a whole range of things that are actually connected to this. But I think in terms of the younger generation, I think it is a lot to do with social media. I think it's a lot to do with media and the stories that are told, and how the narrative around surrogacy is that it's all, lovely and happy, and there's no one actually, it shows, obviously the other side of it, as we've talked about, and that's the side that we see. So when we speak to women who've been surrogate mothers and they have regret over their decisions, or perhaps they haven't been treated so well by the commissioning parents. I mean, this case that I mentioned, and the link in the chat, obviously there was a reason why that relationship broke down, and that was the relationship between the surrogate mother, her husband, and the commissioning parents, who are both two men. And there isn't any detail in that particular article about what happened, but why is it that that relationship broke down? It's not all happy, smooth sailing, unfortunately, and it can be rare, but obviously it does happen, and it's those cases that we want to highlight and raise awareness of.
If you know about the research on the damage to the baby of this early separation,
I can't see that one in particular, but so there are studies, obviously the attachment theory. John Bowlby is someone I would recommend reading about. So attachment theory has been studied and well known, and I mean, in fact, we don't know that much about the fourth trimester as we experience it, which is the first 3 months of a child's life. But there are studies, but ultimately you can't actually conduct an ethical study because you can't create a control group. And the reason why you can't do that is because you can't ethically separate a baby from its mother deliberately on purpose to study for the purposes of actually, and then returning that child to compare it to a group where they're not being returned to their mother. I mean, I have personal experience of a friend of mine who was totally fine. She returned from labor, and they went home, and then she had to go into emergency surgery, and the child was separated from her mother for, I think it was 12 hours, and she screamed constantly to the point where it was obviously dangerous for her own life. She was brand new baby, screaming at the top of her lungs, and the moment she was returned to her mother, just her mother's smell comforted her. It's something that, even though I don't feel that we need to study it, I think that we know it. I think that it's quite simple, in the same way that we know what a man is, we know what a woman is. There are some things that we just know. We don't need to study them in great detail. We know that children should be with their mothers. Brand new babies should be with their mothers. And we separate children from their mothers only under extreme examples, extreme situations where there's a danger to the child for their health or their well-being. And it's just not possible for that family to be together for whatever reason that might be. We don't do it for any other reason, and I don't know why we would consider it to be acceptable in society or as a practice, because it's surrogacy, because somebody has paid money or has paid some expenses. There's no other reason why we would do it. So that brings the whole question of surrogacy out into the sunlight, really, and we need to discuss it and be able to challenge the reform that's coming.